Hello there. So I'm Nicole Wilbur. Welcome back. And I'm very excited to be chatting to Christopher Courtin, who is the author of Stealing Stanley, which is a really exciting kind of like heist caper story, and is one that I had the absolute privilege of getting to sort of critique, partner, beta read for. So yeah, welcome. Thank you so much for hopping on with me.
This is great. Thanks for having me on.
Perfect. So we were just chatting, and I was trying to think because I think we've been critiquing for quite a good chunk of this year, like back and forth. How did we get connected? It was Twitter, I think, where
Yeah, it was.
yeah,
I think it was Twitter. I'm no
yeah,
longer on, but I was for a bit.
yeah.
And um, yeah, I think it was
Was it?
just general.
Yeah,
Someone was talking about critique partners, and I said
yeah.
I'd be open for one, and you responded, and that was it, really. Yeah.
And I think that's why I think this would be a cool conversation because we were both wrote heist. I feel like most genre fiction has its conventions. Like a romance is very solid and a mystery is very solid. And even though heists aren't like a one you see on a shelf, it's one that has like very specific kind of expectations and conventions and stuff that you have to learn and sort of decide what you're going to adopt and how. And you had a really interesting comment saying you originally were calling Stealing Stanley a heist and kind of changed it over to a caper. Tell us about Stealing Stanley and where the idea came from, and then we'll chat about sort of the heist aspect.
Sure. Yeah, the idea for Stealing Stanley as a concept is like literally 20 years ago, I think. My family, my parents were huge hockey fans, still are, and so hockey night in Canada was always on every Saturday, and so I kind of grew up with that, and vicariously the whole mythology of what the Stanley Cup was and represented. I mean, it's a pretty unique trophy. It's the only one that gets carried on year after year. Most of the other major sports things, they make a new one every year, and the team gets to keep the trophy. So it's more the symbolism of what the trophy is. But in the Stanley Cup, it is the literal trophy. So I mean, I like heists. I like stories in general, but it's like, why would anybody want to steal the Stanley Cup? So that's sort of the idea, I guess, that first grabbed me.
Yeah.
It's stealing, it's one thing, but why would you want to? So I had to. It was fun to come up with the puzzle of the story about people who would steal it, but also the reasons behind it.
Yeah, that's really cool. And so you started with the concept and then kind of brainstormed from there the why and the antagonists and everything around it.
Right. Yeah. I originally titled it the subtitle of Stealing Stanley is a Margot and Harley heist. I changed that to Caper, and it's perhaps a bit semantics, but as the story evolved, as I wrote it, it started to diverge a bit from all those key things that you mentioned of what people expect in a classic heist story, and a lot of that's in there, but a lot of it isn't. So I toned it down to Caper. I don't know.
Yeah, what are some of those elements, I guess, that you think you have versus don't have?
With a heist story, like a classic heist story, the protagonist is the one doing the crime, which is
Yeah,
different from many other things. Usually the criminal is the criminal and your protagonist is, the police or whoever is trying to stop them. But
yeah,
with a heist story, it is the good guys are the ones doing the crime. So you need to have some sympathetic way to have your characters so that you can be rooting for them, even though they are, doing criminal things.
yeah.
So that's hugely important. I think for sure it's the big score. I think the when people watch a heist movie or read a heist book, they're expecting at the core of the story is a big project to steal something.
Mhm.
And I think typically, whether it's a movie, whether it's a book, there's usually, it's either a bank or a casino, but there's a vault. You're trying to get into a vault.
Mhm.
So that's obviously a big one. And inherent in that are all the complexities, because obviously there's security and obviously there's all these things that need to be overcome, and usually there's big timing elements and all that. And with all heist stories, I think it's important as to why they're doing it. It's the how. People like the puzzle of the how. How are they going to pull this off?
So yours, instead of, I think what's cool about yours is that it's a non-traditional score. I mean, mine is a violin, but it's in a museum. It's like it's like in the art category for sure. And yours is a trophy, and I mean, I don't want to spoil anything. Um, so that's a unique twist on it to begin with. And I think that was sort of, I asked kind of what elements were there that you felt were there in the story and what elements
Right,
weren't.
right.
And I
Yes.
think
Okay.
you were kind of getting at, and we've talked about a little bit, is like the whole thing is like a big project in a heist to get that score. Whereas,
Right.
and I've struggled with this a lot in mine too, because neither of our main characters are necessarily heist career, like they're not the mastermind who's been doing this for 30 years and this is the final score. They're very much people who just kind of like stumbled into this situation and now have to deal with it. So it is hard to like get them on board, get them to start planning.
Yeah, ours are sort of thrown into things, which it's definitely still works with the genre. But my story was Stealing Stanley, and where it hits, I think the classic heist themes are that yes, there's a big score for sure.
Yes.
There's a great crew. A crew, yeah, for sure. Heist stories have to have a crew.
Yeah.
Ideally, part of the first bit of the story is once the job is identified, it's putting that team together. There needs to be a crew. There needs to ideally be the members of that crew should have their little specializations. There's a reason that they're putting this team together. Usually it revolves around the how they're going to do it. They need somebody who's the lock picker. They need somebody who's, the tech guy and so on. So it's usually very much about these different talents that have to come together to make the whole thing work. A bit of that in mind. Your story, I think, has definitely more of that element to it, where the characters are somewhat chosen for their different abilities that all mesh. Mine, they just happen to be in an elevator together, and they have to make do with it.
Yeah, and honestly, I struggle with that a little bit too when I go over the crew in my head. Like, there's two of them who I'm like, what they do is changed. I kind of go back and forth with them on like what their specific skill set is, and where not only do they have to have a particular skill set and particular thing that they're like really good at, but it has to be useful in the heist. And so that's always tricky because you have to come up with the obstacles that the people can specifically solve. I feel like there's so much like mechanical thinking that goes into these kinds of stories because you have to come up with all the security, like, and then come up how to thwart the security. And then of course come up with how the plan to thwart the security is going to go wrong and then how it's going to be fixed.
Yeah,
How was
yeah,
your experience doing
absolutely.
that? Yeah.
For sure. Yeah, there's almost, I think it's unique in sort of the subgenre that it is that so much is around the mechanics of the puzzle. I mean, obviously with any story, character is so important. You need that element and the motivation for why they're doing this, usually has to, well, not usually, always has to be a strong one. And particularly for those who enjoy puzzles, like creating puzzles, solving puzzles, because there's a lot of room in a heist story to express that creativity for sure. Oh, twist ending. We didn't talk about twist ending, but many classic heists do have a twist ending, and that can come out in many different ways. So again, that relates to the puzzle thing. Do you like puzzles having that twist ending? Kind of fits in with that.
So is there anything if you were to I don't know, rewrite? I know that you're working on a sequel. Is there anything that you would kind of do differently in your process? Or I mean, the book is the book and the book is great. But kind of like retrospective, one, what is it, 360 retrospective is 360, something like that.
Oh yeah, there's a good term for that. Yeah.
Can't remember what it is right
No.
now. Uh, but is there anything that you would do in that respect that you would change?
Definitely. Yeah. Again, going back to what I think is the classic heist structure, where the story is typically you're identifying the problem, the job to be done, and it's usually that one big last job, we do this and then we can retire, or there's some usual pressure. There's only one opportunity to ever do this job. Otherwise, it's just another heist in these guys' career, whoever the team is. So I think there has to be something special about it. Um,
Some sort of
I
time
covered
limit, like
that.
you have to do this now. You're given a deadline. I think both of ours have that too. Not necessarily one less job, but it's like
Yeah,
you
but
have
there's
this amount
there's
of
a
time.
definitely forced time element to it, which
Yeah.
adds to the sort of inherent drama of the story.
Mhm.
Once you've done that, and then in the classic, like you're putting the team together, both of our stories, that's sort of a forced issue, which I think is totally fine, but it does divert a little from sort of, I guess, the classic version. And then it's all the planning, and that's for sure. If I was to do it again, I would have more of that to make it more of a classic heist. It should have there should have been more development of the actual plan to steal it. My guys get a little lost in the weeds of trying not to steal it, which I think is, because it's a comedic story, I think is sort of fine. It sort of works, but yeah, there could have been that going on, but also, okay, if we had to steal it, how would we do it? and
Mhm.
and there could, because there's, not to give too much away, but there's more officially one version of the Stanley Cup, and there's one version that stays in the vault in Toronto at the Hockey Hall of Fame, and it's actually an old I think it's an RBC bank. It's an old bank, and you part of, there's actually three versions. The original trophy is in pieces, and you walk into this old vault, and they're all displayed around. And then outside of that, in sort of a foyer area of what was the, I guess, the bank where the tellers used to be, is sort of their display area, and they have a version of the cup there so that people coming to visit can actually see a Stanley Cup. But the real one that's used, that you see on TV when the games, and what the one they actually give out, the presentation copy, is the one that they're going after. But there could have been more to try and get into the Hockey Hall of Fame. How would you actually break into it, which would have put it much more in a classic sort of heist setting, where they're trying to break into a building of, a vault, literally in this case, and do that. So that could have absolutely been done. If I were to do it again, I probably would have some planning around that element, which of course then all goes wrong, and then they have to go to plan B. But that's probably the main thing.
Yeah. And I really like the point that you made about them trying not to steal it for a little bit, and that being where some of the humor comes from. Because one of my favorite things about your book is it's absolutely hilarious. Like some of the lines are, I mean, a lot of them are just wonderful, and you get so into it. And writing humorous, like comedic writing like that is really hard. Um, and you do it so well. Do you have any sort of sense, or like, is it just instinctive, or do you try to come up with scenarios where humor will happen? Like, how do you work on that bit?
I think most of the humor actually comes in later. It's rare that on that first rough draft pass through that there's that much humor. That, there's probably a little bit, hopefully,
Yeah.
but typically it's when I go back through and edit, and then the funny lines, I guess, come to mind. How people, yeah, I probably develop more of the character input in the editing pass, and the first is a little more mechanics, even though this is sort of the only heist story I've done, and the next one is not a heist story. It's more classic kind of murder mystery ish. um it it that first pass is mostly mechanics. I'm definitely a plotter, I'm not a
Yeah.
pantser, so I have everything is, here's Clover Point, the next one.
Oh my God.
Yeah, and so it's all broken down chapter by chapter, beat by beat, and so that first draft is just filling in the blanks, mostly getting the story mechanics there, and then so yeah, the characters and the humor that goes with it, I guess, comes out in the editing
Sort of
pass.
yeah. One of the things that I've found really interesting and difficult is I will have a line or two that I think is funny, and then because of structural reasons and story reasons, I'm like, oh, I have to get rid of that section. For a while, I had a pig that was in the story for a little bit, and I actually, in the version, I don't know if you've read it yet, but I had to take it out because I was like, this is just not doing anything. This is too long, and I was really sad because I missed Dana the pig so
I remember the pig. Yeah.
I miss her, but I did take it out. And I mean, I think that's something that I really had to get over. This is one of the first times I've done like heavy editing on a story like this, where it really is killing your darlings. So that's a hard kind of lesson for me, and especially, taking in feedback of like, this isn't really advancing the story from beta readers and critique partners, just kind of having to go with it. My question is, based on sort of critiques and your own beta readers, what's kind of one of the harder things that you've had to, I guess, learn or change in editing Stealing Stanley?
I had two or three books that I'd written before Stealing Stanley, which was for me just sort of part of the learning process. I had big hopes and dreams, but none of them really went far, and that's a good thing in hindsight. But one of those there was always this one scene, and I just loved it so much, and nobody else did, and that was a painful thing. I had the protagonist is caught by the bad guys. He's up on like the 12th floor of an office building, and he's been duct taped to an office chair, and he gets rescued. It's all very dramatic. He gets rescued. The one of the other protagonists swings in through the window, breaks it, clips. She's like dangling from a rope from the penthouse. So she's rappelled down the side. She swings in. She breaks through the glass. She clips onto his chair, pulls him out, and then they both plummet down. I don't know why, but I love this scene so much, and I did everything to force it in, and nobody liked it. Nobody liked it. So that was the hardest lesson. With Stealing Stanley, I think just having gone through that painful process for me of having to realize that this scene, no matter how much I was in love with it, just did not fit. With Stealing Stanley, I think I was more prepared that people weren't going to like things, and I could deal with that better. That said, there wasn't a whole lot. There was a huge struggle with the opening scene. To get it to a point that worked. I was either starting too early or starting too late, and I think many people struggle with that element. But
so my two final questions, hopefully they're easy ones. So what are you working on now?
What am I working on now? The direct sequel to Stealing Stanley, which is called Clover Point. So same characters, same location, and but a different story, and like not a heist, but more of a classic murder mystery. And it's I'm excited to get into it. It's sort of all planned out. I had big hopes for NaNoWriMo, but life got in the way, and that didn't really happen. But hopefully after Christmas and the new year, I had an ambitious plan to try and have things ready for my critique partner to have a look at by maybe March, but we'll see.
Yeah. We'll see. Well, I'm excited to look at it whenever it's there. And then my last question was, do you have any advice for someone who is sitting down and saying, I want to write a heist story or a caper story? What would you say?
What would I say? I would say, first of all, awesome. Don't lose sight of the characters. For sure, the how is super important in a heist story, but the why is equally important, and you've got to have your characters still have to be, like with any story, they've still got to be some character growth. Anyone writing it, have fun with it, for sure. That goes with writing any story. If you enjoy the process, then the story will be that much better for it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So with some kind of criminal, what I know you're still in, it's not in the final form yet, but it's getting close. Yeah. Are there elements of a classic heist that were you to write it from scratch again that you would change?
That's a really good question. I think that I've edited it kind of over time to have more of those elements. So my very first draft, it was a lot more Lena, the main character, being forced into doing the heist, and it really wasn't working for me. I was having a hard time writing her not wanting to do it, but still having to do things. So I ended up going back and kind of rewriting and making her decide very early that yes, I'm in and I'm going to do this. So that was helpful. I also, the very end, there is a twist. With at the sort of the very last scene, you kind of reveal something that you thought happened and it didn't. And that was not in there from the beginning. That was a later edit that I did because I, was looking at heist conventions and thought, you're supposed to trick the audience at some point, and I'm not tricking them. And so I put in that twist, I put in the trick. Um, Other conventions, I think, I don't know, are there others that I would do? I do think I wish I had more time to kind of bring the team together and to do that in sort of a more fun way. For a while, they just kind of all showed up. It's a little bit better now. I think I have them kind of showing up in pairs, which is nice. But I think some of the fun things about High Stories is just how like crazy and wild some of the introductions are. And I think I could have maybe gone further with those and further even into their like unique like superpowers. Also, I have an email from you here, and another sort of convention was like classic heists involve, interesting names to like. There's lingo, there's more like con type feeling, and I don't have any of that. Nobody is like pulling a Beijing tea or anything. They're just trying to think of it as they go, and so it's not something I would necessarily pull in now, but making them feel more like they're so young too. It's YA. They're like 17. So they haven't pulled that many heists. But maybe even having more of like a history to the crew that's very well established is something I might have delved more into from the start as well.
Right on.
Yeah.
And with Lena, what's she's your protagonist.
Yeah.
So her growth throughout the story,
Yeah.
from beginning to end. How did that evolve over time? And when I first write it, how my protagonist is at the beginning and how they are at the end, there isn't generally a huge amount of change factored in, and that sort of comes in later in the process. And hopefully, it's a satisfying growth to the reader. But
Yeah.
just wondering how you approach that aspect.
That's a really good question. The first draft, I think I had some of it in there, but not a lot. I think I'm similar to you in that the characters really came out in subsequent drafts and sort of the heart of what the story was. My first draft, Lena's kind of like internal problem, there was kind of two pronged, and I worked with a professional editor for a little bit, and she kind of came back to me and she was like, okay, so she either needs to like really not like music, or she needs to, there was something else, or like really have a problem with her aunt. Like it has to be or the other. It can't be both because it was kind of the two of them and it was getting confusing. Um, and the things are very closely linked, but it's like, so what is the journey? Is it her journey to loving music again, or her journey to discovering what it is for herself, or is it her journey of like, her relationship with herself and her aunt and that kind of thing? So I think that really came out in subsequent drafts. Even her like, that's internal, even her like external development, there really wasn't very much at the beginning either. She was kind of like, she was sort of strong at the beginning, wishy-washy in the middle, and strong at the end. And so I had to change it to give her, so she's a very active character throughout the whole time now, but just in different ways and, willing to do different things. And so if we wanted to buy Stealing Stanley, where would we go? How do we find it?
Easiest way is on Amazon, wherever you are in the world. Just look for Stealing Stanley, a Margot and Harley caper by me.
Perfect. I will definitely put the link in the description. So you'll be able to check it out there, and you should read it because it's a really fun one and absolutely hilarious.